Okay, I wanted to wish a warm welcome to everybody. We're going to go ahead and kick this off and get going. So it's my pleasure to lead us off today, and just wanted to say thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to join us for this brief 30-minute webinar, and also just a big thank you to our customers and partners that basically made a lot of this research possible. So for today's webinar, we're going to be jumping into the store of the future and how some of the research that we've done throughout this last year shapes what customers are looking for in store experiences moving forward. So to briefly run through today's agenda, I will be introducing today's hosts, and then also we'll be introducing you to George, who's going to be running through the actual research itself and some of the findings. And then towards the end of the meeting, we'll have a Q&A. So just to call out, if you're unfamiliar with the Zoom webinar features, there's a chat button and there's a Q&A button. As we're going throughout the presentation, please use that Q&A button. If there's any questions that you want to ask, we'll have dedicated time towards the end of the webinar to address those questions. The other things I wanted to ask is that a lot of this research that we do, or we continue to do, actually comes from folks like you. So if there's certain questions that pop up that you're like, wow, I'd really like to ask real consumers or real customers these types of questions, chat those to us or follow up with the person that invited you to this webinar. And that might be a part of some of our future research studies. And then lastly, we welcome feedback. If there's anything we can do to make this webinar better for you, please let us know. All right, well, I'm going to introduce today's speakers. So first and foremost is our founder, Georgina Nelson. She started True Rating about 5 or 6 years ago and will be leading most of today's discussion. And then also Gareth Johns, who's our Chief Data Officer, will be on, and probably the smartest person that can respond to a lot of the questions that you guys have. And then lastly, to introduce you to myself, my name is Kelsey Erickson. I'm our Global Head of Sales. I've been with True Rating about 5 months now, and I came over from a company called Qualtrics, where I spent the last 9 years. So seeing as our technology was used to conduct a lot of this research, and also I'm cognizant that a lot of the people on this webinar aren't super familiar with True Rating. You heard about the research and that's why you're here, but you might not have ever engaged with us. I wanted to briefly introduce what we do and how, this technology enabled this type of research. So first, what we do is we integrate the customer feedback process right into the purchase experience. And what that has allowed us to do is receive the highest response rates in the industry. So in store, you can see this example on the left, the questions displayed right on the terminal, and we capture 80% response rates in store. And then online, it's right after somebody makes a purchase on that payment confirmation page, and we collect over 50% response rates online. So that was part of the reason that really drew me here, was just the highest response rates in the industries. And then also with every piece of feedback, we connect that feedback with over 50 data points surrounding the transaction, which essentially gives us a built-in ROI calculator in understanding what drives customer spend and repeat visits. But essentially how our solution works is we collect these insights, we feed them back to our retail partners, but then also those ratings get pushed and integrated into Google, raising your brand's awareness and perception online. And lastly, every time a consumer rates with True Rating, we donate to a children's charity. So I wanted to just briefly explain that because it's important to understand who the people were that answered these questions and why we have such a massive sample size of millions and millions of consumers that feed this research and other research projects. So these are actual paying customers. These are the people that show up to your stores. They're not professional survey takers that sit in research panels. So with that, I'm going to pass the reins over to Georgina Nelson, and she's going to walk you through the research.
Hey everyone, thank you, Kelsey, and thank you so much to you all for joining us here today. So as Kelsey mentioned, I spoke about this at Retail Week at the end of last year, and it was basically a presentation on the trends which we'd seen during COVID. And during that time, we probably heard from about 40 million consumers, and we're obviously in daily conversations with our customers, our retail customers across our markets. And what we did know was that the pace of acceleration across retail was unlike anything ever before. Some of the retailers which we spoke to delivered 9-year roadmaps in 1 year. The term COVID speed was coined, and the new technologies which were delivered to consumers and this ever-evolving consumer landscape was phenomenal. But what we weren't sure of, and increasingly it became apparent that many of our customers and retailers which we spoke to weren't sure of either, was what was really going to stay, what behavior was going to churn, what would consumers adopt going forward. And so we decided to ask them. And so this session here is basically going through that research. So sorry, Kelsey, if you could flick through to the next slide. So I'm sure as you guys all read, during COVID, there was many headlines talking about this is the death of the store, the future is online. Even before COVID, we all heard about the retail apocalypse. But our data was really telling us something different. So we began to ask directly consumers which way they wanted to head. And interestingly, through COVID, over 85% of consumers across our markets were all telling us they wanted to get back into the physical store, and 5% that they thought BOPIS would be a permanent move. And so what was it which made that 85% plus really want to get back into store? What made the others want to continue online? And so we really wanted to delve deep into understanding what aspects of those different channels were driving consumer behavior. And I even find this chart a bit dated, to be honest, because we all know that consumers aren't working in those discrete channels, shopping in those discrete channels. They're moving very much in between them. But when you dig down into the reasons, you can see number one of what is driving that in-store experience is staff advice and that face-to-face element. And then you look online, and that key one is convenience. Now, what we see in many of the retail new tech which is emerging is that many are focused on bringing the benefits of those different channels to the other. So you have technologies which are providing the store associate to you while you shop online, or you have obviously all the ability to order in line, a different size, color, etc., while you're in store for that convenience of delivery. But I guess a key question for us was, what aspects of the in-store experience should you really invest in and double down on when deciding, next slide, please, Kelsey, when deciding on how to prioritize your strategies and your budgets. So having now heard from over 300 million consumers across our markets, we have really highlighted, I guess, 4 key aspects of the in-store experience, which cover technology, experience, staff, and brand value. And these are the key pillars which we're seeing are relevant to discussion of the store of the future. So we're going to look at those in turn. So next slide, please, Kelsey. So the first is technology. Now, obviously, the vast majority of tech budgets in the last 18 months have really been deployed in digital as that real acceleration of their online experience. And then in store, it's been a lot about removing friction and cost savings. Now, we asked this question: how can tech most improve your shopping to 1,500 consumers? And interestingly, as you'll see, the 43% said it was locating items. And that's been really interesting, as we've seen many retailers develop apps which have helped them in that engagement of on their in-store as part of that in-store journey. And we often found that this was directly related to higher spend and repeat visits. Now, technology can obviously be a huge CapEx investment, and we've spoken to many retailers who have armed their store associates with iPads and invested huge budgets in technology, but without really understanding whether that is ultimately going to lead to consumers spending more, having a better experience, and returning more frequently. And so what we found is key is to really A/B test these new initiatives and ask directly to the consumer. So Kelsey, if you go on to the next slide, please. I think a key part of technology is obviously a core topic, is what we have seen is self-service checkout, and that has been on a huge increase, especially with all the challenges around staff shortages, reduced labor costs, etc. And obviously wanting to remove that element of friction and faster speed checkout. Now, this is a case study of a 1,000-store retailer who we worked with in Australia, in North America, actually, who has been investing in SCOs across their estate. And interestingly, you can see that when we did a comparison with manned tills versus the self-checkout, you can see that they didn't fare nearly as well across these key attributes in the customer experience. And we also saw a negative impact on revenue and how much people were putting in their basket. Now, again, it's just to point to the fact that obviously all these technologies are a business case, and it's important to ensure that you have all the data from across these data points to really make that assessment. And I don't know whether you can see the participant number, but this was over 10 million consumers who were sampled during this study. So if you move to the next slide, please, Kelsey. So I think as we talk about that second pillar, which moves us on to experience. Now, what makes a great in-store experience is absolutely key. So it can be, subtle. We've seen huge impacts of product demos, store formats, customer participation, product presentation, etc. And we really work with retailers to understand what their real USP and key driver is to that, providing that ultimate in-store experience, which will impact their bottom line. I think what's interesting here is that litmus test of how you felt after the experience and that emotional connection. And as that slide says, not all shopping missions are created equally rewarding when you look across the verticals. Now, as you can see, in fashion and sports retail, they generally do that better job of providing that emotional high connection and experience, obviously because it's generally a more engaged experience, higher discretionary spend, etc. But you can actually see that those across the outlet and the budget sectors actually have reap a much higher return if they do manage to really build that emotional connection and have consumers feeling better about their day with a significant ATV uplift. Next slide, please, Kelsey. Now, this was an example which we an A/B test which we did with New Balance, testing their store layout to see whether it enhanced the consumer experience. And we did this in Australia in their outlets. Now, so when we spoke to them, they were basically saying, the new store formats were going to cost, millions of dollars, but they weren't sure what the impact was going to be on consumers. And this is a common trend to many of the conversations which we've had over the years. Now, what we did with them was actually A/B test the new store format in terms of asking consumers specific questions around the product, the experience, and the value and the service. And they changed things such as product presentation, the way signage, etc., was happened in the store. And you can see when we again A/B tested with the old store formats, there was a much higher element of consumer engagement and they could really reap the rewards. And so then they had the confidence, because we also saw that impact on revenue, to invest in that business case and roll out that new store format across their estates. Next slide, please, Kelsey. The third pillar is staff. And I know this is such a hot topic as retailers all over struggle with staff shortages, retention, motivation, training, etc. And so I thought this was particularly interesting when we asked consumers what they most wanted to see from in-store staff. Now you can see the highest by far is friendliness. And we've actually tested the impact of a smile, where we've seen when consumers record being smiled at, they spend 20% more. And so really looking for that friendliness, that's what will engage a customer, that's what will ensure that they trade up, put another item in their basket and return. And we've seen that time and time again, that close correlation to ATV and repeat visits. If you go on to the next slide, please, Kelsey. Now, I think what's interesting here is when you dive deep into the differences of staffing across verticals, we can actually see that while friendliness remains paramount, there's also different elements in training of the staff, depending on the vertical, which can reap the most rewards as to revenue and how much is spent in that moment and drives engagement. So you can see in fashion, we found that it was all around assistance in the shopping room and in the changing rooms rather. Now, what was interesting here was obviously being offered assistance is the baseline, but the biggest impact on people trading up and spending more was being offered reassurance as to the size and fit. And so that real consultative element of the staff there. In footwear, we found the most significant training element was getting the staff to encourage consumers to trade up. So go for that trainer in the higher range, in the premier range. Now we found, and again, this is a case study on our website with Nike's major franchisee in Australia, RPG, that when when their staff associates explained the product benefits of the trainer, of the shoe, and made it a real personalized experience about asking the customer their name, they saw a 32% increase in average transaction value. And overall, the business saw a 5% increase in baseline revenue once they made that a KPI. In the discount sector, you can see that what's key here is that is compliance. And we found that using True Rating to ensure that head office measures, and in this scenario, it was around mask wearing and compliance of those feeling safe within store, was absolutely key to driving repeat visits and more spent in that time. And finally, in outlet, we've seen that providing a warm welcome when people come into the store, being available and engaging the customer at the till are all key to driving extra visits across the year. For one retailer, we found that friendly staff providing exceptional levels of customer service drove additional visits for an extra $160 million a year. And Kelsey, if you'd move on to the next slide, please. So this one is the final pillar around loyalty. And again, this was very interesting when we saw the changes of emotional loyalty towards brands during COVID. Now, I don't think it's any surprise because I know it's behavior which we've all experienced when we've been wanting to support those in the hard times for retail, those brands which we affiliate more with from an emotional perspective, and often the smaller businesses as well, who we might have thought would be particularly hit hard. But we saw that obviously the differences between in-store and online varied quite significantly, with those in-store feeling a much higher emotional bond with a retailer, which still points to it being a key point of focus for building that emotional loyalty bond. I think what was interesting here is, there's a misconception that this is a Generation Z kind of profile, but actually when we looked across the United States, this was even more prevalent in Florida, which generally has a much higher older population. And so we saw this across the demographic and age groups, this trend. And finally, moving to the final slide, please, Kelsey. I thought this was a lovely reminder of why we're all in retail and with such passion and doing what we do, is that despite the challenges which we've all been through in the last 18 months, ultimately 90% of our consumers said they enjoy shopping because it's fun. And that is a very quick snapshot and a rundown of our research. So I'm going to open it up now to questions and introduce you to Gareth, who conducted and put together a lot of this research. Thank you.
So I did see one question come through, and Gareth, it looks like you kind of chatted it, but maybe in the event, I don't know if everyone can see this or not, but Christian asked, did you see consistency across types of retailers on the key to customer engagement, whether specialty, destination, and or sector, grocery, apparel, home improvement, etc.? Would you mind, Gareth, just kind of verbally sharing out that question or your response to that question with the group?
So I guess the answer would be that yes, we see a lot of consistency across the different types of organizations where we ask this question. And for most of this research, it's a combination of kind of fashion and apparel retailers, some big discounters, and then sort of big box homeware type retailers as well. The biggest difference that we see in any of this is a location-based one, and especially as George sort of pointed out, that Florida is often, at least in the US, kind of very different to the rest, which is, I think, due to the the different demographic of that state. And we can't get right down to demographics because we're maintaining customer anonymity through all of this. So it's not like we're linking to loyalty cards and getting all the demographic data, but at a store level and at a location level, we can start to see some differences. And most of those are more driven, I think, by the area in which the customer responded to the question rather than the type of store in which they respond. Because in general, we're not asking a question about their specific shopping experience for this type of research. We're asking a question more generally about the customer's views for retail as a whole.
Great, thanks, Gareth. Any other questions from the group that we want to address before signing off here? Looks like we had another one just come in. So it looks like, George, this one's from you, from Kennedy. How important a role does CX play in BOPIS or curbside pickup? Do brands risk delinkage with in-store shopping experiences? So yeah, I guess George, Gareth, you guys can take a stab at that.
I think I'm not sure that we've seen any danger of the shopping experience falling, the buy online pickup in store impacting on customers' shopping experience yet. The big one we have seen is the move more from manned terminals to stores that go much more on kind of a self-checkout experience. So I imagine that buy online pickup in store would follow this model as well, which is we do see a drop in engagement by customers that effectively go through the whole experience without any human interaction. And those types of in those types of experiences, scores for how customers feel about the brand and how engaged they are, and also even how much they spend, we do start to see a drop off. So I think there is a move that as retailers go more and more to looking to save costs and bring in more technology that removes some of that human element, then we do start to see drops both in perception and actually in revenue. You're not as likely maybe to add that other item if you haven't had somebody that you could talk to. So yeah, I think buy online, pick up in store probably will suffer from that to a degree. The one that we can say, actually based on our research though, is more the move from manned terminal to self-checkout as being the big one that we've seen.
Great. Any other questions from the group?
We'll circulate the deck and the recording to all participants, and yeah, feel free once you've had a chance to peruse to shoot us any further questions if we can deep dive any aspects with you.
Absolutely. And just as a quick reminder, if a lot of these questions that we asked, again, came from some of our partners. So if there's any topics or things of interest that you guys are curious about, again, follow up with the person that invited you to this webinar. They'll follow up with you to make sure you have the recording and the slides, if that's helpful. So thanks again, everyone, for your time today and for joining our webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.